Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled An Overview of the Budget Proposal for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration for Fiscal Year 2025. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today, we hear testimony from Administrator Nelson about the President's budget proposal for NASA for fiscal year 2025. This committee plays an important role in NASA's mission by providing policy direction and authorizing activities for the agency. While we make progress with language included in the 2022 CHIPS and Science Act, it's been more than 7 years since the last comprehensive NASA reauthorization bill was signed into law. I'm certain that everyone in this room, including the administrator, can agree that 7 years is far too long. As many of our experts have highlighted in committee hearings this year, a lot has changed for NASA since 2017. We must approach an authorization bill with these changes in mind and address a few major topics. The first topic is Artemis. I speak for members on both sides of the aisle when I express the strongest support for America's return to the lunar surface. But support also means asking tough questions about the planned architecture and execution of the program. The second topic is NASA's role in low Earth orbit when the International Space Station is retired. We heard several perspectives on this topic in February, and I look forward to continuing this dialogue as we move forward. A third topic is NASA's management of science missions within the agency's portfolio. We support NASA daring to do big things, particularly in science, but how can Congress ensure these projects, particularly flagship missions, remain on schedule and within budget? As we deliberate on these topics while we consider this important reauthorization legislation, we must also keep in mind recent budgetary issues. NASA doesn't lack plans for future exploration efforts, whether it's returning astronauts to the moon, exploring our solar system, or developing new aviation technology. However, these ambitions come at a cost. In May of 2023, President Biden signed the Fiscal Responsibility Act, capping federal discretionary spending for FY24 and FY25. One of our challenges will be to draft an authorization bill that complies with that law while providing sufficient support for NASA to execute these awe-inspiring missions. Failing to do so will force NASA to take on more work than they have the funding to accomplish, which will not only set NASA up for failure by asking them to do too much with too little. By providing proper oversight and clear direction and authorizing language, this committee can create the framework for adequate funding for the agency's activities. A common theme among the hearings this committee held this Congress is the importance of ensuring U.S. competitiveness in research and technology development globally, and today is no different. While the U.S. remains the global leader in space exploration, we face increasing challenges internationally. Just last week, China reiterated its commitment to landing 2 astronauts on the lunar surface by 2030. Later this week, China intends to launch a mission that will retrieve samples from the far side of the moon. If they are successful, China will be the first country to do so. We cannot allow China to become the front runner in space exploration. There are too many consequences for our competitiveness, our national security, and our continued ability to explore space. With clear direction from Congress, NASA will ensure that the U.S. remains a global leader in space and continues to inspire millions of people around the world. I want to welcome Administrator Nelson back to the committee, where he served for many years. I look forward to working with you as we move forward with our NASA authorization bill. And I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from California, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join Chairman Lucas in welcoming Administrator Nelson back to the committee to discuss the President's budget proposal for NASA. We appreciate your leadership at NASA and that you are here again today. Amidst what can be times of geopolitical, economic, and environmental strife, NASA continues to be a bright spot, a North Star that sparks a sense of wonder and curiosity about our planet, our solar system, and the universe. NASA's mission to advance space and Earth science, human exploration, aeronautics, space technology, and STEM education continues to bring us together, and that's something we need. Here in Congress, there's broad bipartisan support for NASA's mission. Beyond the United States, NASA continues to lead us in activities that serve the peaceful exploration and utilization of outer space. The value of these intangible benefits cannot be underestimated, nor can we forget the direct value that NASA R&D has had on societal challenges such as climate change, space weather, and even on tracking and characterizing potentially hazardous near-Earth asteroids. Today's discussion provides an important opportunity to examine NASA's progress towards meeting our policy goals for the United States Civil Space Program, to identify opportunities for improvement, and to understand what NASA needs in budgetary, workforce, and infrastructure resources to accomplish its inspiring mission. The President's fiscal year request for NASA is $25.384 billion, about a 3% increase from the enacted fiscal year 2023 appropriation. I believe this request allows us to keep the Artemis 2 demonstration on track, advancing Moon to Mars activities, and investing in sustainable aviation, among other activities. However, last year's debt ceiling agreement does impose caps on discretionary spending, and that presents challenges for all our federal research and development agencies. NASA's no exception. Under the 2025 request for NASA, high-priority science recommended in recent National Academy decadal surveys cannot be initiated. The timeline for Mars sample return is to be determined. Previously selected science missions are being pushed to the right or even canceled, while other productive science observatories, such as the Chandra X-ray Observatory, are proposed to be phased out. For human exploration and spaceflight, NASA's plans call for transitioning from use of the International Space Station to commercial low Earth platforms at the end of the decade. At the same time, NASA also plans to begin an annual cadence of Artemis missions to the moon. In short, a bow wave is building. There's no sugarcoating the current budget proposal. I recognize that tough decisions need to be made. It's essential that this committee understand what drove some decisions in the proposal over others as we evaluate trade-offs, and it's also imperative that NASA has clear plans for action on the other side of the present budget horizon. Lots is at stake. I'm especially concerned, as the chairman has mentioned, about reductions in workforce, including those in my home state in California, resulting from prolonged mission timelines. Losing skilled talent is a further setback that cannot be erased. We need to look holistically at the implications of the 2025 proposal on the health of NASA now and in the future. How will we position NASA to meet the future? Or will we stay on the tail as other nations that don't share our values advance, as the chairman has expressed? As a ranking member, I will continue to ensure we position NASA for success and that the United States continues to lead in the exploration of outer space. I want to thank you, Administrator, for your extraordinary leadership of NASA, and we welcome you back and thank you for your service. I yield back, Mr.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Let me introduce our witness for today's hearing, Mr. Bill Nelson, who serves as the 14th Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Administrator Nelson's career includes over 4 decades in public service. He represented Florida in both chambers during his 30 years in Congress, and I would most importantly note, including 6 years of chairing the House Science Committee's Space Science and Application Subcommittee. That's a real resume item, Mr. Director. Thank you for joining us today. I now recognize Administrator Nelson for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Mr. Chairman, with your permission to submit my written statement in the record, and if I may, just give you a couple of thoughts, and then let's get to your questions.
Without opposition, absolutely.
NASA is a storied organization, and this agency does amazing things. A lot of the things that we do is right on the edge. And next Monday night about 10:30, we're going to launch another vehicle. It's human-rated. This is the first time that America has ever had 3 human-rated spacecraft. The one that will go to the moon, which is Orion on top of the big rocket, the SLS. The Dragon, which flies on the Falcon 9 and is part of the commercial crew and cargo services to and from the International Space Station. And now the third one, the Boeing Starliner. This is the first test flight. We have two test pilots, Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams, that are flying this test flight. And if successful, then we will have three, the first time this has ever happened. It's all a part of us continuing to, in the human space program, explore the heavens. We're learning so much on the International Space Station. It's an international station. 15 nations participate. And there is science that is just coming of age. Some of the pharmaceutical research is just going to knock our socks off. We are also going back to the moon after a half century. We're going back not just to go to the moon, we're going back for the reason of learning enough so we can send humans to Mars in the decade of the 2040s. NASA's science program, you read about it all the time. I mean, the James Webb Space Telescope, look what it is discovering out in the universe. And I could go on and on. The aviation program, we're going to fly that needle-nose jet this year, proving a different design that we can fly passengers supersonic across populated areas and not have the big bang bang of the sonic boom, but it would be more of a muffled roar. And so it goes on. And I will stop right there well before the 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman, and be delighted to try to answer your questions.
Thank you, Director Nelson, for your testimony, and the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Administrator Nelson, it was recently reported that NASA is considering changing the mission profile for Artemis 3. The mission scheduled for September of 2026, which is currently intended to land humans on the lunar surface. The potential change in profile would result in a mission where astronauts do not land on the lunar surface, but rather remain in low Earth orbit. Is NASA actively considering an alternative mission profile for Artemis 3? What's going on, Mr. Administrator?
Mr. Chairman, this is part of our commercial program, and SpaceX is signed up to land in September of 26. Next year, September of 25, we are going to launch a crew of 4, 3 Americans and a Canadian, and they will test out the spacecraft, and it will circle the moon and come home. A year after that, SpaceX is signed up to provide a lander where we would go into a new kind of orbit, a polar orbit, a irregular or elliptical orbit, and the crew will transfer into the lander. Now, that is what is provided in the contract. The article that you're referring to is speculation. Well, what happens if they're not ready? Well, naturally, people think about these things. But the plan is to land, and it would be 2 astronauts of the crew of 4 that would get into the lander and go down and land. And I might say, think about the Apollo program and the Artemis program. Artemis 3, the first lander that SpaceX is contracted for, is the equivalent of Apollo 9, Apollo 10, and Apollo 11. So it's it's a very accelerated program.
Very much so, Mr. Administrator. The 2023 Decadal Strategy for Planetary Science suggested a total cost of $5.3 billion for the Mars sample return. Significant increases to that estimated cost have triggered several project reviews, including NASA's ongoing efforts to reassess the program. As NASA reconsiders the approach for the Mars sample return, is NASA still targeting a total project cost of $3.5 billion?
3.5 is unrealistic, but I pulled the cord on it, Mr. Chairman, about 2 weeks ago because the independent review boards had said the cost was going up to $11 billion. And it was very possible that we were not even going to get the sample back until 2040. And that's just simply unacceptable. And so what I did was I said, I want to go out to all NASA centers, which includes the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I want to go out to industry, which we now have done with a request for information to come up with new ideas. By the way, I checked in yesterday with the head of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory on how their ideas are, and they are quite excited about coming up with new ideas that can bring that cost down and also get that sample back earlier.
Well, certainly we wait with enthusiasm to hear those. One last question, Mr. Administrator. In October, the President submitted a domestic supplemental request to Congress requesting funding for a U.S. deorbit vehicle to safely decommission the ISS, as well as funding to help rebuild the NASA facilities in Guam and at the Armstrong Flight Research Center. Congress has not passed a supplemental appropriation package yet to date. Is the funding for the Guam hurricane package included in NASA's FY25 budget request?
No, sir. It is just like the Department of Defense. That request for the Guam dishes is a request in an emergency supplemental because that was as a result of a typhoon. Our request is $400 million, of which we have been cutting and pasting and chewing gum and baling wire as an interim solution. And our request pales by comparison to DOD. DOD is something like $2 billion request, ours $400 million. But also in that request is the request for the funding for the deorbit vehicle. Why is it an emergency? And it shouldn't be in the regular request for appropriations. Because we don't know what Vladimir Putin's going to do. We built the International Space Station with the Russians. We operate it with the Russians. We have had no hiccup whatsoever with the Russian cosmonauts, nor Moscow Mission Control and Houston Mission Control, of which we have both Russians and Americans in both. We do an integrated crew on the Soyuz. There's an American astronaut on the Dragon. There is a Russian cosmonaut. And but we don't know what the president of Russia is going to do, and we could be in an emergency situation that we have to get this structure that is as big as a football stadium down and down safely in 2031. And that's why I'm making the request and I'm pleading to you all in the Appropriations Committee to put that in the emergency supplemental bill that will be coming up later.
How much money are we talking about, Mr. Administrator, for the deorbit vehicle?
For fiscal year 24, $180 million. For the total cost over 6 years, it's going to be $1.5 billion.
Okay. My time has expired. I now turn to the ranking member for her questions for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Administrator. You have to make some tough decisions given the budget, and I don't envy you for that. It was interesting to hear about the Mars sample return decision, and I understand it better now that you've given us your testimony. But are we really starting over with a clean slate on this, or what's the need for additional technical analysis? I mean, where are we on this?
We are not starting over. As a matter of fact, I'm just saying we can't do it at $11 billion.
Oh, I'm not disagreeing with that.
And a sample not even a return until 2040. So let me give you an example of what the director of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory said. They're looking at, instead of this huge Mars lander that would then have an ascent vehicle, which was the original concept and was one thing of many that was running the cost way up, use existing legacy proven techniques and hardware, such as the sky crane that landed 2 landers, rovers, the size of a truck. We've got Perseverance up there now, running around digging. These samples are about the size of a cigar, sealed in titanium tubes. We want to get most of those back. So come up with new concepts, bring new ideas. In this particular case, it was using a particular legacy. But we want all those ideas to come forth. And then sometime this fall, when they're in on their deadline, we will evaluate them. And at that point, make a decision going forward. And hopefully, it's going to be much more in what is in line with what the independent review board said. And we've had about 3 of those. And that was that the cost should not exceed somewhere in the $6 billion range.
Let me go to another topic. In the NASA Authorization Act of 2022, enacted as part of CHIPS and Science, we extended the Enhanced Use Leasing Authority for 10 years. For those not familiar with it, that allows NASA to lease underutilized, non-excess property owned by the federal government and under NASA's jurisdiction to private sector entities, state and local governments, academic institutions, other federal agencies. I know in terms of Ames, this has been very successful. We've got UC Berkeley about to open. We've had Carnegie Mellon there. We've had various other entities, USGS that has come in. There's a synergy that has been created. How has this worked around the United States, not just at Ames?
And Google.
And Google, yeah.
Is another major
Yeah, they're maintaining the field.
Yes, ma'am. Well, it wasn't too long ago that I was sitting up here on Capitol Hill begging to get enhanced use authority instead of doing this piecemeal 1 year at a time, to get it for a number of years in the future in order to do just exactly what you have just outlined at Ames. And so another one would be, for example, at Stennis. We've got this huge area because when you test rocket engines, you want to have a buffer so that people are not disturbed by the sound of the rocket test. So what we've done is we brought in other agencies of the federal government there, and it becomes a mixed use space facility. Same thing at the Kennedy Space Center. The Congressman Posey can tell you, I mean, that place has come alive.
Yeah.
Those old rocket pads that had weeds growing on them have come back to life. There's a lot of commercial activity there that has allowed, because of with regard to NASA's Kennedy Space Center, the mixed use with the enhanced lease use.
Let me just, if I may, Mr. Chairman, make one more comment. The Jet Propulsion Lab in California recently had to lay off more than 500 skilled, talented employees as part of the pullback on MSR. And I'm not disputing your decision, I understand it, but it's really tragic to lose that kind of talent. Do we have a plan to recapture that kind of talent that we've lost? I mean, decades of experience. That's a tragic situation. Do we have a way to recapture that?
Well, let me try to set the table for you as to why this occurred. Had we had our 24 requests and 25 requests, that wouldn't have happened. However, the Congress in its wisdom, and I can tell you that if I had been in your seats, I would have voted for the bill, because the alternative was the federal government to go into default. And the government, full faith and credit of the federal government to be impugned. And the sacrifices, the trade-offs, or the compromise, if you will, in order to get the votes to pass that in both houses, was to cut the spending in both 24 and 25. NASA was cut $2.5 billion in almost in each of the years 24 and 25. Science, NASA science, just in 24 was cut $1 billion. So if I've got a smaller potato sack that only holds 5 pounds of potatoes, and I've got 10 pounds that I want to get, it's hard for me to get those 10 pounds in that 5-pound sack.
I've gone over, and I appreciate your comments. I think it's really, we should look in the mirror, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Mr. Administrator. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Nelson, good to see you back again. Regarding the deferred maintenance we have on the aging structures, how do we make sure that we prioritize the infrastructure needs going down the road? And I know it's the same problem slightly you just talked about. But
Yes, sir. You can't build infrastructure without some money.
yeah,
And so where do we cut in the budget? I just gave you one example that we're trying to still succeed with the Mars sample return at a cost of about 1/2 of what it was projected to be. Infrastructure is one of the biggest problems we have. It is aging infrastructure. It's right there in your district, but it's in every center and NASA facility in the country. And what I'm hoping is when you all get through with the cycle of 24 and 25, that come 26, with all of the fiscal other things that you have to consider, that there might be some more appropriations for NASA to address its facilities needs.
thank you. Can you speak to the importance of NASA's commercial partners in supporting the space station?
Say that again, Congressman.
Can you speak to the importance of NASA's commercial partners supporting our space station?
Oh, absolutely, and they are. Look at all the science with commercial partners that we have going on. Not only the science like pharmaceuticals, but the planetary science that we have going on. Commercial partners, as we go back to the moon, we don't go back just as the U.S. government. We're going back with commercial partners. And the example is both SpaceX and Blue Origin are developing landers. And once we have both, then we'll make a choice between the two. So commercial parts of NASA happen to go back to the 2010 NASA bill, of which Kay Bailey Hutchinson of Texas and I had something to do with.
Yeah. Could you explain how China uses space as a foreign policy tool?
How China does, or how
China
all
does.
of us do?
Yeah.
Well, let me say that, when we fly a foreign astronaut, that certainly is a part of a foreign policy tool. When we do a foreign experiment, when the University of Edinburgh is a major principal investigator on the James Webb Space Telescope, that's all foreign policy as well. Likewise, China tries, but is not nearly as successful as we are because they're much more secretive in their space program.
Yeah. How do we counter their announcement that they're going to invite international astronauts to fly in their space station? We've already done that in many cases, obviously. Been there, done that, but.
Well, we're not going to counter it. We'll see if they do it and to what extent. It's just like they say that they want to put international contributions into an experimental place on the south pole of the moon. Of course, my concern is that they don't get there first and then say, this is our area, you stay out. Because the south pole of the moon is an important part, we think, because we think that there is water there, and if there's water, then there's rocket fuel. And that's one reason we're going to the south pole of the moon.
Yeah, they're not going there to study the origins of man or collect rocks. They're going there to colonize, and everything that they do has a military component to it. You know that. I know that. That's great concern. I see I'm about to run out of time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Thank you for being here, Administrator Nelson. Nice to see you. Welcome back to the committee. I thank you also for focusing your testimony on the many ways that NASA benefits America. And one of those examples in your testimony is NASA's climate and earth science research, which we know is so essential to the health of the planet, really strengthening resilience in our communities and ecosystems. Those NASA satellites are so critical with giving researchers the data they need to monitor and forecast extreme weather events, climate events. And we know the data also provides wonderful educational opportunities to inspire the next generation of scientists and engage the public. And also thank you for the new Earth Information Center at your headquarters here in Washington, D.C., helping with that critical piece of science, improving science communication. So you stated in your testimony that much of what we know about our changing planet is rooted in NASA's more than 40 years of Earth observations. And the suite of satellite resources supports that Earth science mission and the scientific community by providing an access of variety of measurement data, air quality, emissions, ocean chemistry, surface biology, just to name a few. And I'm especially excited about the contributions of the recently launched PACE satellite, Plankton Aerosol Cloud Ocean Ecosystem, PACE satellite, to improve understanding of ocean health. So NASA's budget for fiscal year 2025 proposes to restructure the Earth Science Observatory program by breaking missions into smaller elements. So I wonder, how did NASA arrive at this new strategy, and what effects could this change have on NASA's long-term Earth measurements and climate research?
Our strategy is to understand very specifically exactly what is happening to our Earth and its climate. We have about 24 spacecraft up there now that are bringing us various pieces of technical information. And we are pulling this together in a composite 3D understanding precisely what is happening. You mentioned one that was more recently, the PACE. PACE is able to look at plankton and we're able to trace it in the ocean like we've never been. The A in there is aerosols, which clearly has an effect upon our climate. We had another one, EMIT. This is a spacecraft. It was supposed to just look at dust storms and how that was affecting the climate. Lo and behold, we got a big byproduct from it. It could identify methane emissions, very specific emissions, so that we could go and try to stop those, or in the case that it might be an industry, the industry might even not know that it had methane emission.
And Mr. Administrator, I want to get another question. I certainly don't question the value of the program. I just want to watch how the change in the budget in this new strategy will affect it. So you also talk about the work that NASA is doing to decarbonize the aviation industry, and aeronautics research programs like the Sustainable Flight National Partnership supports projects to increase aircraft fuel efficiency, for example, and invest in electrified propulsion research could significantly reduce aircraft greenhouse gas emissions. So considering numerous delays and cost overruns, what steps is NASA taking to see these projects through to completion, and how can Congress support that work that NASA is doing on sustainable aviation?
Well, we have a serious project that we invested upwards of $600, $700 million in, a joint project with Boeing on producing a mid-range single-aisle transport aircraft that will reduce fuel consumption by 30%. That project is underway, and that will be substantial. You take, like the Boeing 737 is the most heavily trafficked commercial airliner. If you can save 30% of fuel by a different design of the wing, a high wing that's long and thin, and therefore being high can support higher, bigger fan jets, you can get 30% combination between the engine and the wing. That's a substantial effort.
Sure.
We started on an electric aircraft, but that's been overtaken by industry. So you're going to see a lot of industry coming out with electric-powered aircraft. All of this is to do exactly what the goal is that you stated very eloquently, and that is, the word is sustainable. I call it save energy in flying.
Terrific. My time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Administrator, good to see you again. I'm constantly amazed by how much you know about even aircraft and stuff like that. Where do you store all that stuff? Up here, huh?
Well, Congressman, it used to be, I'm kind of like a bathtub. You fill the bathtub up, you drain it out, and there's a residue on the side. You fill it up again, drain it out, there's a little more residue. So over the number of years, I kind of get an accumulation in here.
I have the sinking feeling you've discussed this before. So let me go to my questions. Many of the employees at Johnson Space Center live in my district. They're in Dr. Babin's, the actual facilities in Dr. Babin's district. We're still trying to route Clear Creek around it so it gets to be in my district. So we've discussed the deorbiting of the ISS at the end of the decade, but not so much what that does to the people that are employed, backing that up. So what does NASA plan to do with that workforce that actually currently supports ISS mission after 2030? Is there a plan?
Well, we want to keep them, but a lot of that depends on what you appropriate. As a matter of fact, the fact that this 2 years, 24 and 25, that NASA has been cut between the 2 years, $4.7 billion from our initial request, that's going to have an effect on some of the contracts at all NASA centers. And I'm hoping that when you get to 26, that the Congress may see the wisdom of some of these programs. But let me just assure you, you got a lot of folks at Johnson. You got a lot of really good folks on good programs. You'll never have to face the situation that I had to face as a senator for the Kennedy Space Center when we shut down the space shuttle. They had 15,000 employees, and they went immediately down to 7,000 employees. That's not happening anywhere in NASA now. It's much more manageable, but a lot of it depends on the wisdom of the Congress in the future.
Well, I remember the shuttle program going away, and I know that that was heavy on people's hearts. And I'm assuming that they're probably thinking right about now, are we facing a similar demise coming forth? Are y'all communicating this to the employee group?
Absolutely. And what we are also doing, since you posited the question about the deorbiting of the International Space Station, we want to do that only when we have commercial space stations in low Earth orbit in order to do the research and the training and so forth that we need to do in low Earth orbit for our astronauts as they go further out into the cosmos. We think that by 2031, that the business case will have easily been made for low Earth orbit commercial space stations. And we have put seed money, significant seed money, into 3 commercial operations that are now developing commercial stations.
Well, we appreciate NASA taking the lead on that, so thank you for that. China's, I'm not sure I'd say, Qinggong space station is in orbit, and the CCP would love to whittle down on American dominance in space wherever they can. Now, your previous comments about commercial are very, very encouraging. With the coming deorbit of the ISS, what is NASA's plan to maintain American competitiveness with China when it comes to presence in low Earth orbit? You said a little bit about it, but expand on that some. We don't want China to be in the lead. You remember Captain Kirk, the final frontier. Expand on what you mean by that.
And by the way, not letting them be in the lead means beyond low Earth orbit. Also,
I agree.
It means also Moon, Mars, and beyond.
I agree.
For example, we never want to give up this incredible scientific research in LEO. We are on the cusp of major breakthroughs coming up on pharmaceuticals for disease. Let me give you an example of 2. Number 1, Keytruda, and a very effective drug on certain types of cancer. But the cancer patient has to take it intravenously, frequently, long periods of time. They have, with that drug, found out how, through protein crystal growth on the space station, to make that drug into a shot instead of intravenous, so that the patient can go in, get a quick shot at the doctor. That's one example. Stem cell research being used on a whole plethora of diseases. What happens when you grow stem cells in 0G, you can grow a lot more of them. On Earth, when you grow them, they all clump to the bottom, and a lot of them die. In space, they're suspended, and they don't die as much. You then freeze them and bring them back, and that is just in its infancy in research, but there's a lot of promise there.
Well, thank you for that. I'm over my time, but it's fascinating. We appreciate all the help.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Ross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lucas and Ranking Member Lofgren, for holding this hearing, and to Administrator Nelson, thank you for the fabulous job you are doing at NASA. My state of North Carolina has contributed to NASA for decades. It's the home state of James Webb. And then, of course, Christine Darden, one of NASA's hidden figures who broke barriers in the STEM industry and in gender and racial equality, is from North Carolina. We have 3 members of the Science Committee from North Carolina, including my colleague, Congresswoman Foushee. But Christine was the first African-American woman to be promoted into senior executive service at NASA's Langley Research Center. And just last week, I got to join Governor Cooper, a local educator, and a 3rd grade class from the Explorers School in my district to honor astronaut Christina Cook. And she's a 3-time grad of NC State University, and as you know, the only woman selected to join the Artemis II mission. She was also a participant in an all-women spacewalk, which we're still celebrating. I want you to know that I will continue to fight for robust funding for NASA so that we can keep doing the incredible things that you have been leading and everything that makes groundbreaking research possible. So to that end, I want to follow up on some of the workforce issues that we've heard about today. So we hear a lot from the burgeoning commercial space sector, and we know that that benefits the nation, exploration, our economy, and that's good. But it also means that there's increased competition for trained aerospace professionals. And I wanted to know from you, to what extent does that increased competition for science and technical professionals affect NASA and your ability to fill and retain experienced, top-notch people?
Congresswoman, you have put your finger on the allure of private industry to bring NASA folks into private industry because they can pay them so much more, is a real concern. However, there seems to be a mysterious pixie dust at NASA that people enjoy working there. And that's the proof's in the pudding about what some of these wizards do. Now, certainly, any success that we might have is due to the commercial sector as well, because the body that you think of as NASA, which is about 60,000 employees, is basically about 17,000 civil servants and 45,000 contractors. They all wear the NASA badge, but they're all part of the NASA family. And it's that combination that we've been able to be successful. And again, I tell you, everything we do is right on the edge. And when we launch next Monday night, it's white knuckle time. But that's the business we're in. And these folks really are rather incredible.
I absolutely agree with you. NASA's STEM engagement programs are also important to building that pipeline and to STEM students and learners of all ages. And it's important to track the impact and efficiency of our STEM investments, and I'm glad to see your progress in developing and maximizing the use of STEM Gateway. That's the database that lets us know what's going on. Could you speak more about the STEM Gateway and NASA's evaluation work in the Office of STEM Engagement?
Yes, ma'am. You've been generous with us in the appropriations to keep this STEM effort going. Reaching out with grants to universities, colleges, community colleges all over America. We particularly, for example, make an effort to get into rural colleges and universities so that we're not missing the talent that might be hidden out there, like Christina Cook.
Exactly.
And so there is a very serious effort there. We have a huge intern program at NASA that we pay them. We end up hiring 30% of our interns. I wish you could see some of these interns and talk to them. Their eyes are as big as this with excitement, telling what they're working on. STEM is very much a part. And Mr. Chairman, let me just say, as a part of STEM, what we learned from Apollo when we went to the moon and did all of that, it so excited 2 generations of students that they became engineers and scientists and technicians. And we're going to see the same thing come out of the Artemis program as we go back to the moon and then to Mars.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now turns to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, for 5 minutes.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Administrator. Good to see you. And I really liked your analogy about the bathtub a while ago. After a few decades, you know, I guess all of us have a little residue in there. I just need a little bit more in mine. But thank you so very much
Amen.
for what you're doing and your inspiration. And I say that very, very sincerely, talking about STEM and the excitement and the inspiration that NASA instills in our youth to go forward, to create these wizards. So it's very exciting. Thank you. I'd like to start by keeping priority programs, talking about this on track and submitting a FY25 budget request that largely complies with the Fiscal Responsibility Act that the President signed in May. And as we work on the FY25 request, we also have to finalize the FY24 budget. I'd like to work with you to ensure that NASA remains on track despite the challenging budget environment that we find ourselves in now. As you work with appropriators to finalize the 24 spending plan, I'd like to call your attention to a few priorities of mine to maintain existing funding levels within the space operations budget. Congress provided you with a great deal of latitude, and we hope that you're able to use this in a way to use this funding appropriated for space operations, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. While the final 24 appropriations for NASA space operations is $46.7 million below FY23 levels, the 24 request included $180 million for the deorbital vehicle, the USDV, for ISS. The original schedule for awarding a contract for USDV has slipped several times. Under even the current plan to award a contract this summer, NASA could be challenged to allocate funding for USDV within FY24 based on current schedules. And I believe that within this given timeline, NASA could maintain current ISS operations at 23 rates. It's critical now more than ever to maintain the full functionality of the International Space Station that Mr. Weber had mentioned in his questioning, and support our current crew and cargo missions because of the amazing things that are going there. I was a healthcare professional myself, and your story about cancer and creating drugs and things up in zero G are very, very fascinating. I was pleased to see you mention on Capitol Hill 2 weeks ago the necessity of keeping the ISS fully operational until we have a follow-on CLD. It's critical that we maintain our presence in LEO for the very reason that he brought up a while ago. The Qingdong Chinese craft is up there as we speak. And so, Mr. Administrator, I know that you don't have this information at your fingertips right now, but will you provide us with the following information as soon as possible so that we can understand the full range of options that NASA has in implementing the 24 appropriation, so that ISS program can continue to return the great science and advanced exploration that's been coming back? Number one, the amount of funding obligated for the USDV in 24. Number two, an updated schedule for the award of the contract for USDV. Number three, a list of full-time equivalents and work year equivalent personnel for the ISS program for each fiscal quarter for the last 5 years. And number 4, workforce costs and contractor rates associated with the ISS program, including contractors over the last 5 years. And last, number 5, workforce costs and contractor rates planned for the ISS program over the next 5 years. Mr. Administrator, I stand ready to work with you. You're a joy to work with. I've always appreciated you and the great work you've done in your capacity as our administrator. But we need to ensure that NASA has the necessary workforce and funding to enable the continued success, amazing success, 22 years of the International Space Station. And can I count on you to work with me on this?
Of course. And I can tell you that the first question that you asked, in the 24 budget, there is $180 million for the starting of a U.S. deorbit vehicle, which I am begging the Congress in the next emergency appropriations bill, the one that will address Guam and the Typhoon for the Department of Defense as well as NASA, that you include within that, in the argument that I made earlier in the hearing, that is an emergency because we don't know what President Putin's going to be doing.
Right.
And therefore, we cannot count that we will have the cooperation all the way through the next 6 years in order to be able to deorbit the station safely into, most of it will burn up, but the big chunks that are left, to put them safely in the graveyard in the southern Pacific Ocean. And we desperately request that 180 million and the rest of the 6-year total funding of $1.5 billion for the U.S. deorbit vehicle be put in the emergency supplemental appropriations.
I understand very, very clearly. Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman's
Administrator.
time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Sorensen, for 5 minutes.
Good morning. I join the chairman and the ranking member in welcoming Administrator Nelson back to the committee. Thank you for your leadership of NASA during this important time and for our nation's space program. As a self-described science nerd, being a meteorologist and now a member of Congress, I often tell my neighbors back in Illinois how important science is. I explain to them how investing in science helps grow our economy, create good-paying, sustainable jobs, and addresses problems our neighbors face every day. And that is why I champion investing in NASA, one of our nation's leading science agencies, and why the work that you and folks at NASA do is so important. Just this month, millions of Americans were looking up through their glasses at an eclipse. It's my hope that the next generation is interested in science because of what happened. But also, as we look up, we're learning more and more about how solar storms on the sun bring us not only beautiful displays of the aurora borealis, but recent events that disrupt technology and infrastructure. Why is NASA proposing to cut so much of the Heliophysics division funding if we have such a need and understanding?
Well, we're not, Congressman. And by the way, as Congressman Babin is still here, I want to thank the two of you for how you get along, you as ranking and he as chairman in the subcommittee. We wouldn't have had we not had to cut $1 billion from
Right.
science. And that as a result of the compromises that were made in order for the country not to go into default on its debt. And I understand that. And I said I would have voted that way. But it's a hard reality for us, and you have to make some choices of where you're spending. Now, the truth is, we got a lot of good stuff going on in heliophysics. And so we're going to continue. The president proposes, the Congress disposes.
Right, right. And so Administrator, if we in Congress are forced to continually cut budgets year after year, does that mean that there's going to be a growing gap in funding because the public sector and the private sector move farther away? And so I guess what I'm saying is, how do we meet the objectives, for instance, of the ISS deorbit and the Artemis missions if we have a forecast for a growing gap in funding?
Well, that's what I have been pleading for, that come 26, when you get out from under the constraints of 24 and 25, that you will hopefully be a little more generous in making sure that there's not that gap that you described.
What do you think we need to do to make sure, I'm going to go back to the young STEM student for a moment. When we look forward to what we are going to learn, how do we continue to build the workforce that we're going to need to meet our objectives?
Well, the enthusiasm is certainly there. We're trying to steer them in a way by having them, and we have a lot of interns. We send out a lot of grants. We try to distribute that across the board so that you're finding talent wherever it is and get them enthused. Another thing we do, we have a secret weapon, and it's called an astronaut in a blue flight suit.
Right.
And we frequently have our astronauts go into classrooms. And I'm telling you, there's nothing like getting attention and suddenly excitement into the STEM field when they start talking about space flight.
I always look forward to bringing NASA astronauts to my district, and I hope we can do that again here soon. My time has expired. I'll yield back, but thank you so much, Administrator.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Administrator, good to see you again. Feels like it was just last week, because it was. I've been losing sleep over this Mars sample recovery thing for a couple months now, and JPL, especially to use your bathtub metaphor, the brain drain there right now is real. We are losing critical national security talent and workforce there. I know the plan. I don't disagree with it. I get the metaphor of, hey, you had a 5-pound bag and you got 10 pounds of potatoes that you're trying to fit into that bag, and you had to make trades, but I would submit that this is no small potato. And what I'm afraid of is that when we go to open that bag up in FY26, after we get healthy, back on track, and you get responses from this RFI, that you're going to be seeing just potentially, potato chip crumbs at the bottom that used to be JPL. So what I'm worried about is the next 4 months, 5 months. Is there something we can do collectively to keep them whole, to not impart another significant impact to JPL's workforce? Because I'm hearing it from adjacent domains, missions, agencies, that those layoffs are affecting not just NASA science, but also DOD, NRO, true national security implications across the board. We don't need to get into specifics there, but can we work together to look at potential options to bridge the next 4 or 5 months somehow to prevent that bathtub from being drained to the point where it's irreparable damage?
Congressman, I've been losing sleep over this too. The good news is what I reported earlier. I think, were out of the room. I had a conversation.
I was here. I got you. I heard it.
I had that conversation yesterday.
Yeah.
With the head of JPL. And Dr. Leshin feels that they're going to be able to come up with a retrieval of the Mars sample, enough sample return, and get that cost down by using new and creative ideas and old legacy ideas that are much less costly. And so I approached this optimistically. And certainly to get a sample back before 2040,
Sure.
that's just too long.
That's way too long. So is it, what, I guess, walk me through the next, from an acquisition timeline and your acquisition strategy on this RFI. You're going to get responses here in May, June, some ENs, I'm sure some questions that are going to go back to JPL and other industry partners. Is there an opportunity to fund before, say, October 1st and start funding this new approach at some level that is not just necessarily the $330 million that we ended up landing on?
It's somewhere in the fall that we can take the ideas that are generated and then put that into a contract.
Okay. So it may be enough confidence for a vendor, and I'm not trying to put a finger on the scale on source selection here. I want to be very clear. This is an open competition. I'm assuming no one has the inside track, and this is not pre-wired for anyone. But when you get the good ideas back from all of the competitors, you may be able to instill enough confidence in one of whoever the down select folks are, one or two, however many players are, to go ahead and do long lead investments on their own at risk, knowing that there's a lifeline coming in an FY25 line item that would allow them to go execute this program with confidence.
That's my hope, Congressman.
Okay. That's very encouraging. That's, I think, the very important thing for us all to be aligned on. So,
Congressman, I had to do battle to keep this thing from being
no, I know you did. You did God's work, and we didn't help you. I think it's the executive branch as much as the legislative branch, but I think the key now is to figure out how to make 1 + 1 = 3, and to get to a lower price point, get the samples back before 2040, and then, but more importantly, keep that center of the universe asset in Pasadena whole, and if not whole, at least sufficiently so that they're not sufficiently staffed so they're not getting below critical mass. So I appreciate everything you've done, Mr. Administrator. Thank you for continuing to do that, and looking forward to that partnership over the next few months. So thank you, sir. Appreciate you. You'll bet.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Fushi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Nelson, for being with us here today. The safety of NASA's astronauts is always top of mind for me and for everyone involved in overseeing our nation's space program. I know how deeply and personally you care about safety, and I know how vigilant you are ensuring that NASA maintains a robust safety culture informed by the lessons of Challenger and Columbia, with which we are all so tragically familiar. But the world of human spaceflight has changed dramatically for NASA over the past decade. Through the Commercial Crew Program, the agency now regularly sends its astronauts to the International Space Station on rockets that are designed, built, and operationally managed by private contractors. The agency is increasingly looking to use this commercial services model for other human spaceflight programs as well. As a result, NASA must be capable of conducting rigorous oversight over the safety cultures of its contractors to prevent the development of blind spots in its own ability to ensure mission safety. I believe it is critical for the agency to have well-crafted and targeted oversight procedures that can ensure its contractors are every bit as committed to a culture of safety as NASA is itself. So my first question is, what tools and procedures does NASA possess to evaluate contractor safety culture?
That is at the top of the list of everything that we do. We evaluate them. We are all over the design. We are all over the building of whatever the spacecraft or instruments are. And at the end of the day, NASA, if it is a human space flight, NASA has the veto.
Thank you for that. If NASA makes recommendations to a contractor about how they can improve their safety culture, Do you expect the agency to follow up with the contractor to make sure that the recommendations have been adopted?
We do that, and we do it all the time.
And finally, do you believe NASA's ability to conduct safety culture oversight of commercial service providers is impacted by the agency's reliance on those providers for indispensable mission support?
If that means, are we letting anything slip, we better not.
That's what it means. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield
And
back.
may I point out to you, Congresswoman, that one of the tragic results of inattention was the Space Shuttle Challenger, and the pilot of Challenger was Mike Smith from North Carolina.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. And I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Oklahoma, Ms. Bice.
Thank
5
you.
minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Administrator. It was great to see you in Oklahoma under a bit of sad circumstances with the passing of General Thomas Stafford. We celebrated his life a couple of weeks ago, and I was honored to be a part of that. And thank you for recognizing and honoring such an incredible Oklahoman. Let me start by asking you, I am still fairly new to Congress. This is my second term. And what I have noticed is that there seems to be a lot of work being done in the space arena, but we tend to, in some cases, be siloing a lot of that work. How can NASA, the FAA, and the DoD strategically pool resources and expertise to conduct essential research in an era of fiscal constraints that ensures we'll have continued innovation crucial for maintaining global leadership in civilian aviation?
Well, aviation research is the first A in NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So, where did the wingtips come from that improve the efficiency of the wing? Where does the design of the wing, it often these things that make aviation safer, more efficient, and earlier in the meeting I described, for example, the joint project that we have with Boeing to try to have that single aisle mid-range transport save 30% of fuel. All of this is a major part of what we do. It's not just space, it's not just aeronautics, it's also climate as well, because we have the instruments that measure the climate. We're coming into a new era of air mobility, particularly in urban areas. So the old idea of the Jetsons suddenly flying around, that's right upon us. And we are researching that. And what we found is that a lot of industry, commercial enterprises, are having major breakthroughs in that. And so we're all over aviation, and that is clearly a very proud part of NASA.
You sort of briefly touched on this, but I think it's worth maybe diving a little deeper into it. As you look at sort of what the next phase of space looks like, what keeps you up at night?
At the end of the day, defying the forces of gravity with millions of pounds of thrust, putting human beings up there in a very unforgiving atmosphere and bringing them back alive through the fiery heat of reentry. For the astronauts coming back from the moon, they'll hit 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So that hopefully doesn't keep me up completely all night, but I know that everything that we do like that, we're right on the edge. But that's the part of discovery. That's the part of adventure. That's the part of being in a frontier mode, going out there and doing unusual things. President Kennedy said it best at Rice University in the stadium in September of '62. He said, "We go to the moon and do other things, not because it's easy, but because it's hard." And what we do is hard, but it's worth doing.
Thank you. And I'll just maybe wrap up by mentioning there's a lot of work being done, I think, by NASA to encourage young people to consider getting into the sort of aviation space. And I think we need to make sure that we continue that and focus on it, because I have been to, some of the facilities, and when you see these young people walking through, looking at astronaut suits and previous videos, they get such excitement. And I think we need to continue to foster that, because they are the future of NASA. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair, and thank you, Mr. Administrator, for being here. I want to chat a little bit about the Tempo mission that you've got underway. And if I understand this right, and correct me if I've got this wrong, geosynchronous monitoring North America and sort of hourly neighborhood level granularity. Am I about right on that, of the monitoring capability it's going to have?
Just one second.
This is the mission that's monitoring local pollutants in the atmosphere.
Well, it is one of the ones that is doing that. And what we are trying to understand, all these different things that affect our climate, such as dust, such as aerosols, such as the changing of the elevation of oceans and fresh water. All of these missions are designed on some particular aspect of then putting it all together in a 3D composite.
Yep. And I'm totally supportive of the mission. I guess my first question is just, is that going to be the highest temporal and spatial resolution we're going to have on this level of monitoring, at least from a space-based system?
Well, it is the next iteration.
Okay.
But we'll get even more sophisticated as we go on.
And will the data that comes out of that be publicly available, or is there any concern about, I mean, I could think of national security reasons why we might want to be a little cautious about a particular plume. I could also imagine reasons why the private sector might be reluctant. So what's going to be the process for that data being made available to the public?
It's available.
Okay. In real time as it's released?
Well, there'll be a lag of some seconds,
Okay.
As it comes back to Earth.
Okay. That's cool. Is there the potential to do that globally? And I'm thinking about things like several years ago there was this concern about hydrofluorocarbon leaks from China that were violating international treaties. And I would imagine from a national security perspective, if we had the ability to pinpoint where that leak was coming from at a specific point, it might be in our national interest. The Chinese might have been reluctant. Is there the potential to make this global, or does that create some diplomatic problems?
Global.
Global, okay.
Just like what I mentioned earlier, we have one up there called EMET. It was going to look at dust coming off of the Sahara. Lo and behold, unexpectedly, it can pinpoint very specifically methane leaks.
Oh, wow.
And that's global.
So you are going to be monitoring methane from this as well?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's already happening.
Well, you're reading my mind, and I'm intrigued, and let us know how we can continue to help this. I'm a part of what I'm thinking about on this is that we are going down the path to have global methane monitoring, global methane tracking as a climate forcing compound in the atmosphere. We know that methane leak rates exceed what is documented, right? If you look at like the balance on natural gas extraction and what's sold, we know there's a gap that's bigger. And it's really hard to pinpoint exactly who's responsible. To the extent that this has the ability to get granular and temporal, I would assume that this starts to be something where we can look and say, okay, this specific entity at this time of day was operating in that location, and so we have some accountability. Will that data then be, I guess, what's the plan to coordinate with other agencies on the use of this data?
It is available, and it also is very specific. This is what was such a pleasant surprise about the spacecraft EMET. We can pinpoint methane emissions now so specifically that, for example, if there's a real polluter, we've got the evidence, but what we find out is that some industries don't even know that they are emitting methane, and so this is valuable information for that industry to be able to stop it.
Well,
And methane, of course, is one of the major greenhouse gases.
That's
It and carbon dioxide.
No, it's precisely why I asked the question. We were up in Alaska last year and looking at permafrost melt and how you figure out, where the global balance goes and how you track all that. Well, it's fascinating. Happy to have you here, proud to have you here, and look forward to working with you to make sure that we can continue to expand these programs. Yield back.
All right, sir. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's good to see you, Mr. Administrator, Senator, Captain, Astronaut. There are seldom times where I get to see somebody who has as many titles as I do and more. And actually, somebody who I'm a little envious of is somebody who's actually done something I want to do that I haven't been able to do. As a matter of fact, if you have any advice for a guy who would love to follow your tracks into space someday as a doc and pilot, just let me know. I'll be happy to meet with you for lunch.
We need medical doctors to go to Mars.
I'm sure a lot of my constituents would like to send me there. Appreciate you being here today. In all seriousness, NASA and space exploration are vital for our national security, economic growth, scientific advancement, international prestige, and our inspiration as Americans. Just recently, Venturi Astrolab Incorporated, a startup founded by a veteran spaceflight robotics engineer, has unveiled a groundbreaking prototype of a lunar rover, the Flexible Logistics and Exploration Vehicle, FLEX. If NASA integrates FLEX into the Artemis program, it will mark the return of passenger-capable rover to the lunar surface since Apollo 17 in 1972. It's this kind of discovery that inspires the future generations of scientists, engineers, and explorers. It's pretty exciting to me, too. With this being said, NASA has been plagued by the same issues for years: constant deadline extensions, flawed cost estimating processes, and poor financial management. Administrator Nelson, in your testimony, you highlighted the great success of the International Space Station and the milestone of 23 years with continuous human presence in low-orbit Earth. As NASA approaches its 2030 deadline to decommission the International Space Station and aims to transition to a commercially owned and operated platforms in the low Earth orbit, do you believe that NASA has an obligation to ensure continued human presence in the low Earth orbit?
Yes.
Great. And it's funny, I'm going to get a little bit off track. We just recently talked about some of the pollutants and how Earth might be warming. And I agree, there might be climate change. I think the one thing that worries me is that we get away from science. In a Senate article that was published back in 2007, it talked about the heating of other planets in our solar system. This is back in 2007. It's continued. Would you say there's more concrete, carbon dioxide, and vehicle emissions in Neptune, Jupiter, and Mars during this period of time, just like there is in this Earth?
I don't know.
I would say probably not, because I don't know of anybody who's building concrete or who has vehicle emissions in those planets. They're also heating. I would say that's pretty much factual, unless you know some life that you haven't told us about so far.
Well, what I do know is that we are seeing the heating up of the Earth, and our instruments have indicated that. And we've seen.
Wouldn't discount that at all, sir. And I'm just saying that it's happened to other planets in the solar system too that don't have the same challenges we do. Now, I want to be scientific. You and I are scientists by nature. We love facts. We love to talk about things that matter, things that we can change. But I also don't want to waste time and money on things we cannot change. Back in the 70s, we were talking about global cooling during some of the highest carbon dioxide emissions of all time. And we've seen decreases in certain pollutants while the Earth is heating. So I just want to have a scientific conversation with you and I about what's really causing the heating, and can we affect it, or do we need to put our money elsewhere to help us adjust for those while the Earth continues its natural cycle? Because I am a scientist. I do understand how much carbon dioxide is there and how much the United States produces as a global percentage of that carbon dioxide. Would you agree that it could be due to something other than methane and carbon dioxide that's causing the Earth to heat?
Well, there are multiple.
There you go. Yes, sir. And that's what I agree with you 100% as a scientist. Multiple factors, some which we can and some which we cannot affect. I just want to see our money go to the right place. I know I'm almost out of time. I'm going to ask you one more question. Commercial and international patterns are key to the success of the Artemis campaign. The Commercial Lunar Payload Service, the CLPS program, housed within the Science Mission Directorate, has resulted in the first ever landing on the moon by a commercial entity and the first U.S. landing in over 50 years. Are there opportunities beyond the Commercial Lunar Payload Service where the Artemis campaign and Science Mission Directorate have mutual interests in the development of commercial capabilities?
When we are going back to the moon as a result of, I take it back to the 2010 NASA authorization bill, we said we're going to do it in a different way. We're going back with commercial partners. The CLIPS program that you just mentioned, interestingly, is like we are sending scouts into the wilderness ahead of time on the South Pole to scout out for us before we get our astronauts there on the surface, so that we've got a better idea. One of the things that we're clearly looking for is water. We've got a couple of instruments that are going this year on CLIPS missions. One called Intuitive Machines that is actually going to be digging on the South Pole to see if there's water content. We know there's water there because we've seen the ice in the crevices of the constantly shattered rocks. But this is all a part of making the space program something larger than just as we went to the moon before. And we're going to the moon, by the way, not just to go to the moon. We're going to the moon to learn how then we can go all the way to Mars and beyond.
Thank you, sir. I'm without time, so I yield. Thank you.
I'd like to recognize a gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director, Senator Nelson, I actually am going to start with a question from my 13-year-old son, who wants to be an astronomer, who is a big fan of the great observatories. He looks at, uses images from Hubble, Spitzer, and even the now deorbited Compton telescopes. But he wants me to ask you specifically about Chandra, the X-ray telescope that under the current budget proposal looks like could be ending. And he's very concerned, as I know a number of astronomers are, that this could leave a blind spot in the collection of X-ray information in the future. So can you assure my 13-year-old son, Jackson, that NASA is still committed to X-ray images in space and the data that you collect in that way?
Earlier, I had talked about how the compromises that you all had to make, which are certainly understandable, caused 24 and 25 to have less money. In science, just in 24, it's $1 billion cut. And so you have to make some choices. Chandra has been phenomenally successful, but we have new missions that are coming on. We're going to keep it going as much as we can. You just can't sustain it at the previous funding levels. And so we are having a senior review during this year to get community impact on alternative operational scenarios for Chandra and the Hubble Space Telescope as well, to move to a more cost-effective way. I can't spend for NASA money that we don't have.
I understand that. I understand that, and I think that question that I just asked is an example of how important it is that NASA makes science fun and exciting for kids. Because again, the images that he has seen from these telescopes have gotten him more interested and fascinated in STEM subjects in school than anything else that his father and I could have done.
May I point out that Chandra is 25 years old, and it's having operational issues with regard to thermal problems.
No.
So we're going to keep it going as much as we can, but we have to lessen the funding.
And I understand that. But could you speak to some of NASA's programs that are focused on our younger students, particularly during the summer and time they spend out of school, so that we can get more students as passionate about space and science as my son is?
Well, for example, the discoveries that we're having with the James Webb Space Telescope is just phenomenal. Every day almost, it seems like there's a new discovery. If he's particularly interested in the far reaches of this universe, it's not too long. We're already discovering other planets with that. The ones that we've found thus far are gaseous, but we've got another mission coming that your son, as he grows up and stays interested in this, is going to be interesting. And it's called the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope, followed by Habitable Worlds Space Telescope in the 2040s. We're going to be able to find other stony planets that are just the right distance from a medium-sized star that has carbon and water on them. And lo and behold, that's beginning to be another planet like planet Earth. I mean, there's so many possibilities out there.
Thank you. And going to more college students, can you talk about how NASA's budget will continue to support partnerships with HBCUs and increase outreach efforts to students who are currently underrepresented in the STEM fields?
We specifically reach out to HBCUs and other minority institutions. In the grants that we give out, we make sure that we do that. And an example I gave early in the hearing is that, for example, we give grants to rural universities and colleges that otherwise might not, a student there might not have the opportunity of receiving a grant like that. So we're trying as hard as we can to distribute it across the country.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Strong.
Thank you, Chairman Babin, Ranking Member Lofgren, Administrator Nelson. Thank you and your staff for being here today to discuss NASA's FY25 budget request. I have the privilege of representing Alabama's 5th Congressional District, home to NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. I'd like to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to all the hardworking civil servants and contractors at Marshall. I would like to also note that I have full faith and confidence in Marshall's newest director, Joseph Pelfrey. Mr. Administrator, following a successful uncrewed SLS test flight in late 2022, your agency planned to launch a crewed lunar flyby mission Artemis 2 in November of 24. Earlier this year, your administration revealed that because of various hardware issues, the Artemis 2 mission is now delayed until September of 2025, nearly 1 year behind schedule. Mr. Administrator, what specifically led to this nearly 1 year delay, and what impact will this have on future Artemis missions?
Safety. We do not fly until it's ready, and we never will, as long as I'm around. I've seen 7 of my friends suddenly be killed in the Challenger disaster that was 10 days after the flight that I was on. We are sending a whole new spacecraft and a whole new rocket to the moon. We're going to make sure that that heat shield is functioning as it should be, because they are coming in hot and fast. They're coming in at Mach 32, and it's 5,000 degrees. This new spacecraft, Orion, is a very complicated machine, and we're just simply not going to fly it until it's ready.
Thank you. Delays always lead to need for more money, and in a physically constrained environment, that concerns me. As the leader of NASA, what actions have you taken to ensure that Artemis 3 mission and future Artemis missions stay on schedule?
Well, again, we're not going to fly them until they're ready, but in this case, Artemis 3 is the first landing on the moon. We have contracted with SpaceX for September of 26. That's the contractual date. But if they're not ready, obviously we're not going to fly.
Okay. Marshall is home to the best propulsion experts in the nation. Marshall has also proven successful in manufacturing projects such as the rapid analysis and manufacturing propulsion technology. How is NASA leveraging additive manufacturing to best optimize technology for future Moon to Mars missions and deep space exploration?
Marshall has a brilliant future in nuclear thermal propulsion and nuclear electric propulsion. And I think it's going to take that to get us to Mars, because right now it'd take us 7 or 8 months with conventional chemical propulsion. Once you got there, you'd have to stay on the surface a year or two until the planets realigned so that you could get back in 7 or 8 months.
I totally agree. I think that's the only way we can get there.
I think we got to go faster.
Absolutely. Marshall has partnered with Auburn University's National Center for Additive Manufacturing Excellence to improve the performance of liquid rocket engines. Liquid rocket engines serve as the core stage for NASA's Space Launch System, also managed at Marshall. How can advancements in additive manufacturing and liquid rocket engine performance be leveraged by NASA to mitigate Artemis mission delays?
We're doing that all the time. All of those new discoveries, we improve as we go. That's the whole point of the development of the space program.
The President's budget request proposed funding the space operations account below the level required for full operational maintenance of the International Space Station and the crew and cargo program, as well as future commercial low Earth orbit destinations. What strategies is NASA exploring to ensure operational flexibility within the outlined budget while maintaining its commitment to transitioning from the International Space Station to commercial low Earth orbit platforms by 2030 and integrating commercial services without interruption?
Are you asking specifically about the end of the International Space Station?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's 2031. We want to keep it going for the next 6 years. Why? Because look at all the science that's on it, but we want to replace it with commercial stations so that all the science, the training, all the things that we do in low Earth orbit can be done on a commercial station, which at the same time has a business model that they can make money on a commercial station bringing business off the face of the earth up to Leo. Now, we have put some serious incentive money into 3 commercial companies to build a commercial space station. And that is the intent. By 2031, when we would deorbit the space station, that there would be the commercial stations ready to go.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yes, sir. Gentleman's time's expired. We're down to just a few minutes to go vote. And so if it's okay with you, Mr. Administrator, we will reconvene as soon as we get through the last vote. Okay?
How many votes do you have, Mr. Chairman?
7.
Oh, my.
Yeah. They're 2-minute votes.
Okay.
2-minute votes. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Okay. Thank you very much.
If you make 2-minute votes, you've done a miracle more than I've ever seen.
Well, we're going to try. And now I've got to run down there in 2 minutes, too. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Committee, thank you for indulging us while we had to cast 9 votes, Mr. Administrator. So thank you. It's good to see you on the floor, too. I hope that brought back good old memories. Okay, well, we're going to resume our 5 minutes of questioning by our members. And let's see, Mr. Tonko, gentleman from New York, you're first for 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
I thank the chair and the ranking member for this important hearing today, and thank you to Administrator Nelson for the work you do to ensure the success of the world's preeminent civil space agency and your awesome leadership that you provide. Up in my district, New York's capital region, I'm deeply proud of the critical research and tech development being done at world-class academic institutions such as Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I'm particularly thinking about the R&D there that relies on funding from the Biological and Physical Science Division within NASA's Science Mission Directorate. The BPS division funding provides novel opportunities to better understand the impact of the space environment on both life and physical sciences. Discoveries made on the International Space Station with BPS funding have advanced our understanding of quantum mechanics and helped facilitate the advancement of semiconductor-based electronics. The BPS has also enabled advances in immunotherapy, regenerative medicine, osteoporosis treatments, and neurodegenerative diseases. Despite how important this research is, the BPS budget within the Science Mission Directorate remains severely underfunded and was acknowledged as such in the recent decadal survey. In fiscal year 23, and BPS budget was 84% less than it was in 2004. And as a result, the number of investigators in the state of New York has decreased by some 67%, causing significant reductions in education and training and negatively impacting the local economy. Specifically, at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, the BPS division currently funds approximately 4 PIs and over 25 graduate and undergraduate students. However, just a few years ago, that number was closer to 7 PIs. Without significant reinvestment, labs funded by BPS will no longer be sustainable as the number of grants awarded is reduced and be forced to change research directions, threatening the success of NASA's exploration goals. So, Administrator Nelson, how is NASA attempting to be responsive to the ambitions of reinvestment from the biological and physical sciences community decadal survey in this constrained budget environment?
Congressman, when John Glenn first flew, we weren't sure what was going to happen to the physical body. There was even concern that would the eyeballs stay in the sockets. We had flown a chimpanzee prior, but you just think when you don't know what's going to be the physical, biological reaction and how far we now have advanced, where we are realistically getting ready to go back to the moon in order to prepare to go to Mars. And so the function of the amount of grants that would go to a university such as the very eminent one that you just mentioned in your district is a function of the amount of the budget that you give us. Just in sciences in this fiscal year 24, because of the constraints that are upon you in 24 and 25 as a result of the compromise reached to be able to avoid the default of the full faith and credit of the United States government. For example, just in science, it's $1 billion cut in 24, a similar cut in 25. Once you get to 26 and don't have the constriction that you have on the budget, I wish that you would, because the area that you have specified are areas that we have to know what's going to happen in order to send humans all the way to Mars. The moon is 4 days away. Mars is 7 to 8 months away, unless we develop the new technologies such as propulsion of nuclear thermal, nuclear electric propulsion that could get us there faster. If we go conventionally 6, 7, 8 months, then we're going to have to stay on the surface a very long time until the planets realign to get back in 7 or 8 months. So these are all a part of the challenges, but they're also exciting problems to solve. And we will keep those grants going to universities, because that is a main source of the research that we do at NASA.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chair, I have another question that I was going to ask. I'm out of time, so I will forward that to the committee. But it's my hope that through this budget process, Congress will recognize the crucial importance of this research to help BPS and NASA fully realize its mission. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. It's good to see you again, Administrator. It's good to see you in Northeast Ohio just a couple of weeks ago for the eclipse, and I really appreciate you coming out to Cleveland and spending the afternoon with us. It really means a lot, and to have you there is very special. While you were out there, we had some great conversations, including about the importance of NASA Glenn Research Center, which is located right in my district, to NASA's mission. Administrator Nelson, NASA's Space Technology Mission Directorate funds a lot of significant priorities for NASA, many of which the Glenn Research Center is involved in. However, funding for STMD has been relatively stagnant over the last 5 years. The fiscal year 25 budget request proposes ramping up funding for STMD in large part to support the development of fission surface power technology to create a nuclear power system that could operate on the moon. Administrator Nelson, can you please talk about the importance of fission surface power and why we need to invest in it now and not just further down the line? And could you please address the importance of Glenn's role within the project?
Yes, Congressman, and it was great seeing you in Cleveland. And before I forget, for Congressman Tonko, our commander going to the moon, Reed Wiseman, on Artemis 2, he is a graduate of Rensselaer Polytechnic. Congressman, we got to have more power on the moon. We go to Mars, we got to have more power, particularly as you get further away from the sun and you can't rely on all solar power. And so fission surface power is going to be a necessary element. And we're going to start this with the moon. So this is part of the reason we go back to the moon, in order to go to Mars. The 25 requests is 113 million. Now, do you want me to get into nuclear electric and nuclear thermal as well, or do you want to keep it to fission surface power?
I'd like to keep it to fission, just because mainly that's what's up there that we're working on.
Okay. Well, I certainly respectfully request that you all grant our 25 request of 113 million.
Yeah. Okay. We'll take a look at it. I understand. And I get it. And as you had already acknowledged, that it's been a tough year working with the budget. And the last thing that we want to do is to cut down anyone. But we have to make sure that we're being responsibly and efficient for the country. But yes, Administrator, I'm with you 1,000%. And thank you for your earlier answer. Additionally, as you know, NASA Glenn Research Center leads the Communication Services Project, which leverages commercial capabilities to provide next-generation data relay for NASA satellites and to ensure that there's no data gap as NASA's older communication satellites continue to age. Can you speak to the importance of the work performed at Glenn? And do we have your commitment, possibly, that you will provide the resources to the center that needs to complete this project quickly?
You can't fly in deep space unless you can communicate. Our deep space communication system ran into a problem because we need to communicate with all of those science instruments, including the James Webb Space Telescope, bringing back all of that data from deep in space, and lo and behold, we had to have the capability of communicating to Artemis 1 in the test flight of the rocket. And we didn't have all of the bandwidth that we wanted. So we need to improve that. And this is especially essential as we are going further and further out into space. Right now, in low Earth orbit, we got enough communications. We can handle that. We need to update it, modernize it, etc.
Yeah.
But deep space is a different thing.
Well, if there's anything that we can do to work with you, and especially at NASA Glenn, getting them the resources or just getting the education or familiarizing us with how we can make it more efficient or to get to the next step, I would really appreciate it. And what makes me just really glad to hear is, your acknowledgement of how important NASA Glenn is, not only to our region, but to the country and more so the world, and the capabilities that we have there. And I just, once again, want to thank you for your time. It's been truly a pleasure to work with all of you and your staff. And so just thank you again, and anything we can do in the future to work together to make sure we can continue to evolve and progress in the right way. You have a friend in me. So thank you, Administrator. I yield back.
Congressman, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, if I may, another example of the deep space communications that we just reestablished with Voyager 1, which is outside of our solar system, approaching interstellar space. And it came back to life. And lo and behold, we got it. And where it's located, so far away at the speed of light, the transmission takes 22 hours. And we just reestablished that.
What, if you don't mind my asking, Mr. Administrator, what caused that to come back into force?
Again, these wizards, they do all kinds of things.
Okay.
And this is a spacecraft. It's a very old spacecraft.
Right.
Voyager 1, I think it was launched back in the 70s. And so it is still perking.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. That's great information to know. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Frost, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, Administrator Nelson. With the goals of returning Americans to the moon and aiming for Mars, the Artemis program has private partners in all 50 states and over 24 in Florida's 10th Congressional District, which is my district. Artemis is a significant contributor to NASA's $4.7 billion economic impact on Central Florida alone, and has partnered with the University of Central Florida Go Knights on several research projects to support lunar landing and living. This is why my colleague, Congressman Posey, and I are leading a bipartisan letter to the CJS Appropriations Subcommittee calling for additional Artemis funding to overcome delays and technical complications. Mr. Administrator, with all the challenges of such a complex and cutting-edge program, what can NASA do to minimize further delays in the Artemis mission cadence?
Well, first of all, we can have congressmen like you that help us make an additional request. Understand that we're not going to launch until it's ready. And that is because safety is our first. When we put humans on an explosive bomb called a rocket, we're going to do everything possible to make sure it's as safe as possible, realizing that everything is cutting the edge of the envelope. that we do. But especially when humans are in the loop, we're going to make it that much more safe. So, we're on schedule next year to have 4 astronauts circle the moon and check out the Artemis spacecraft. We are under contract with SpaceX for September of 26 to have a lander of which we would go into lunar orbit and they would transfer in and go down to the surface for 6 days. Obviously, if that lander's not ready, we're not going to fly at that time. But that is the schedule, and that's what the contract calls for.
Thank you. And the most recent success in the partnership of NASA and private space industry was a soft landing on the moon's south pole as part of the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program. How does the work of the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program complement the work of the Artemis program?
They are scouts for us, just like sending scouts out into the wilderness. So, for example, one of them that is going on intuitive machines at the end of the year is going to start digging in the South Pole to see if there is water underneath the surface. If there's water and it's in enough abundance, then we have rocket fuel.
And overall, what can we as members of Congress do to support the nationwide economic and scientific impact of NASA's work, especially when it comes to the Artemis program? I mean, we know that I think any day now China will be sending, will do the first mission to bring back things from the far side of the moon. We know this is funding these programs is the best in the best interest of our national security and the work that we do. But what can we as members of Congress do?
There's the old saying, the president proposes and the Congress disposes. You're in it. You're our partner. You make it possible for authorizing us to do this stuff and then appropriating the means by which to do it.
And lastly, can you briefly describe some of the scientific highlights of the commercial missions in terms of the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program?
Oh, yes, sir. For example, this last one, it was an intuitive machine. It caught its leg on a rock as it was coming down, and it tipped over. The fact that it tipped over, it didn't have its antenna pointing in the right direction to receive. But it was still faint enough that we could get enough to know that it was alive. There were 6 NASA experiments on board. Now, this is an incredible story of the chairman of the full committee, Hal Rogers, in his district, is a university, Morgan State. They have big dishes that can support the commercial program. But in this case, the clips wasn't able to communicate. They didn't have enough power from their commercial communications. But Morgan State was uniquely positioned that it could also communicate with our government deep space communications that had the power in order to receive that weak signal. And therefore, most of the objectives of the mission were successful with a connection there made through Morgan State. That is an example of a daring do that suddenly the NASA scientists and the commercial community and a university were able to figure out real time.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mr. Administrator, and yield back.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I'd like to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Administrator, great to see you again, and sure being on Capitol Hill and testifying in these committees is among your favorite things to do. So we have a hometown hero that is in orbit right now on the International Space Station, Dr. Jeanette Epps is beloved by her hometown of Syracuse and really has inspired a whole generation of young kids in school, and she is the talk of the town and the toast of the town. She's only been up there now for almost 2 months. Can you give us some insight in the importance of her work and her mission while she's up in space?
Jeanette is an example of the extraordinary ability of our astronauts, their capability. In her case, she had to wait a long time to fly. And yet, she is there on orbit for 6 months, performing great science and maintenance of the International Space Station. Sometimes our astronauts have a great disappointment. The best example that I can think of is Deke Slayton. He was one of the original 7. John Glenn, Alan Shepard, etc. Deke was one of them, and they discovered a heart murmur. And Deke was not qualified to fly. And yet Deke then took the role as the chief of the astronaut office through all of those years of Gemini and Apollo.
For Dr. Epps, if I may, can you talk about how her mission is helping us get back to the moon specifically?
Well, everything that we do on low Earth orbit is in preparation for us to have the understanding and the preparation so that we can go further. And that's what we're starting to do, to go back to the moon, not just for the sake of going to the moon, because we did that a half century ago, but we're going back to the moon to learn in order to go to Mars, just like we are doing things in low Earth orbit on the International Space Station to go further. In addition, we're doing serious science on board the International Space Station. Earlier in the committee hearing, I had testified about things going on cancer research with the drug Keytruda and with stem cell research. All of that's going on. And although I don't know Jeanette's specific science project that she's working on today, she will be working on a lot of that science.
Well, we look forward to having her back, but not too soon. She's got a lot of work to do while she's there. I'd like to spend the last little bit of our time talking about the Draco project and the cooperation between NASA and DARPA with nuclear energy and propulsion. Are we still on track for a 2026 test launch? How is the Draco project progressing?
Draco is primarily a DARPA project. We are working with them on nuclear thermal. It's a joint NASA-DARPA project. Yes, it's my understanding that it is on schedule. It is testing out nuclear thermal propulsion. That's not the only nuclear propulsion. There's also nuclear electric propulsion, and I hope to get this cranked up and going. Why? Because we need to go faster to Mars. Chemical propulsion will get us there in 7 or 8 months. Nuclear thermal, nuclear electric can get us there faster. The reason that's important, if we can go fast, we don't have to stay on the surface on the first time, second time, a year or two until the planets realign. We'd have a chance of getting back so that we go for a short visit, test out what we needed to with all the systems, the equipment, the spacecraft, the landers, etc., and get back. And I think nuclear thermal and nuclear electric is the propulsion of the future.
Great. Well, if we get nuclear propulsion, sign me up. I'd be happy to go. Thanks very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
And I want to say also, Congressman, that the end of the story about Deke Slayton is he ended up flying. He did an experimental medical procedure, and it worked on the heart murmur. And he was able to fly years later. And that was a good thing. But just think of all the time he had to wait.
It's a very good thing. Sure was. Okay, the gentleman from California, Mr. Mullen, 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Administrator Nelson, for your testimony today. As you know, the International Space Station is authorized to operate through at least 2030, after which time NASA plans to use commercially developed space stations to support its low Earth orbit research and development. We're nearly halfway through 2024, leaving just 5.5 years to ensure that commercial stations are ready and certified for NASA's use. I'm particularly concerned about the risk of losing access to low Earth orbit for research. There are so many important discoveries and innovations that have been developed thanks to NASA providing this platform to do it in space. So could you just share with the committee what the risk might be of a gap in sustaining how low Earth orbit R&D activities should commercial space stations not be ready, and then how might a gap affect our preparedness for Artemis and the development of low Earth orbit ecosystem in general?
Congressman, we don't intend there to be a gap for the reasons that you just articulated. It is so important that we keep this continued presence of being able to not only research on fantastic things like pharmaceutical discoveries that benefit us here on the face of the earth, but also in preparation for going further to the moon and to Mars. For example, we would be training our astronauts in zero-G in low Earth orbit on a space station before we would send them to the moon or to Mars. And so those are just a couple of examples of why it's important. And we do not intend for there to be a gap. And thus, it's all the more reason that as you all give us direction in the authorization bills, and as you partner with your appropriations committees in giving us the financial means in which to do this, that we continue to have the development of this commercial space stations that will take the place of when we want to deorbit the space station, because it's getting old, and we want to deorbit it in 2031.
Thank you for that. I appreciate your optimism. And thank you for your testimony, sir. With that, I yield back.
I now recognize Ms. Lee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last year, I had the pleasure of meeting with Deputy Administrator Pam Melroy, and was really taken by her passion for expanding opportunities in space exploration and STEM. When I chose to serve as a member of the Space Science and Technology Committee, I envisioned opportunities to work with my colleagues to expand the realm of STEM education and workforce beyond those who have traditionally had access to them. I hope the work we do and the funding we are advocating for here today will make dreams of so many students from underserved areas. I think of Trayvon Martin before he passed, who wanted to be an astronaut. I think and hope that the funding that we advocate for here will make some of those dreams become a reality around our nation. While NASA has no physical infrastructure in my district, Pennsylvania's 12th, the businesses in my district are crucial to the work that the administration does. For fiscal year 23, my district won over $58 million in contracts across 19 businesses and universities, including small and women-owned businesses. Proposed budget cuts to NASA at 22% or more below the fiscal year 23 enacted level is an attack on the brilliant minds and our innovative, industrious business owners who fuel American leadership in space exploration and technological development. NASA has extensive partnerships in Western Pennsylvania, partnerships that it relies on to carry out its various missions and mandates. This current Congress continued to find new, innovative ways to shortchange or take away from the American people, especially the amazing scientists, students, and workers in my district who are helping to fuel NASA to discoveries and technological developments that will vastly improve the human conditions here on Earth. I will continue to ensure my region thrives around this space economy. Administrator Nelson, I congratulate NASA for the 2 commercial lunar payload services missions that have flown this year. These missions have fostered national pride in our nation's space program and produced considerable momentum for the future. I know there are more missions on the way this year and next, including some missions that promise truly groundbreaking science and exploration opportunities. Some of these missions will also demonstrate important infrastructure for improved renewable energy generation, such as space-based solar power. Can you just please discuss some of these missions as well as outline your commitment to the lunar discovery and exploration programs in CLIPS?
Right from Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, is a company that's Astrobotic.
I know the one.
They are going to have a mission later this year with a huge instrument on it called Viper. And it is scheduled upon landing to drill down in the South Pole underneath, maybe go down that far, and to see if there is water in abundance. We know that there is ice because we've seen that in the crevices of rocks that are in constant shadow. So if there is water, then there's rocket fuel, hydrogen and oxygen. The CLIPS missions that are going, as I described earlier, are like scouts. They go out and they scout the wilderness before the humans get there. And that's exactly what we're doing. We will have the South Pole of the Moon characterized by a lot of these commercial landing missions, usually with NASA instruments. We will have it characterized much more in depth. At the outset of your remarks, you mentioned something about your admiration of Pam Melroy. I want you to know that is very mutual admiration. Pam Melroy is the real deal. She's the 3rd woman in the Air Force to be a test pilot, and she is the 2nd woman in NASA to be a space shuttle commander. And so your recognition of talent is certainly right on the mark.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And while I do have 2 other questions, I'm happy to have let you go with that one, and I'm happy to yield back. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Administrator, thank you. Thank you for your valuable testimony and for the members for their question. The record will remain open for 10 days for additional comments and written questions from members, and this hearing is adjourned.